Today we're going to discuss the manual audit and the questions on the observer report form for the manual audit. Those are the questions starting on the bottom of page 2 and they go through page 5. One of the items you can look at, and it's a good idea to read over and bring with you to the audit, is the Audit Procedure Manual published by the Secretary of State. Occasionally this is updated, but there have not been any changes in the last couple of years. It talks about the chain of custody and counting principles. In general, those are the questions we ask about the manual audit, and especially about the way they count. It talks here about double checking every step of the way. It recommends putting batches of ballots together in stacks of no more than 50 and counting them. It suggests using counting teams of 4, although often we'll see counting teams of 2, which under the right conditions and the right methods can also do a great job of counting. It talks about things like counting the ballots before you count the votes. And it talks about other things like sorting ballots that apply to some elections when there's more than one kind of ballot in the same bag. And importantly, it talks about the observers and the role of observers. Basically, we should not interfere with the process, but on the other hand, we should be able to go anywhere, see anything we want to in the audit. We really should not be talking to the officials doing the counting. Of course, if they start small talk, as long as it isn't about the election, feel free to respond in a normal way. But if you have a question about what people are doing or anything else about the audit, you should really address that question to the people leading the audit. But they should not. You should be able to see how they're adding things up. If they have pieces of paper that they're writing things down on, you should be able to see them. You should be able to look at the ballots, at the seals on the ballot cases or boxes, and also be able to, of course, see the ballots as they're counting them or they're doing hash mark things. And the moderator's return. There's a moderator's return for every district, and that is where the person, the moderator who's in charge of the polling place, fills out all the results for that polling place. In the case of a primary, where there's actually a primary for more than one party at the same time, then there'll be 2 moderators' returns, because officially those are 2 elections, one for each party. So enough of that. Let's go on and take a look back at our observation report, and we are going to go to the bottom of page 2 and where we have a question CM1. As we said before, when we have 2 letters naming a question, that means it applies either to the manual audit or the electronic audit. Today we're talking only about the manual audit, and so we're going to address some questions where the second letter is M. So the first one is about ballot counting, and notice the instructions above, and this applies to many of the following questions. Answer the questions based on what could have been observed, even if you were not able to actually observe everything. And also carefully note that the following question is about ballot counting, not about counting votes in races. So what do we mean? Answer the following question based on what could have been observed, even if you were not able to actually observe everything. Well, there may be 1 or 2 observers, and you may have 5 tables of counters. You cannot watch all 5 tables of counters at once with only 2 observers. With only 2 observers, you may only be able to watch half of the people in a 4-person counting team at one time. So the question is, observe where you can, and based on what you see, then answer these questions. So ballot counting was the total number of ballots counted before the votes were counted for races. Were the ballots counted by each team such that a second official verified each count? If multiple teams counted ballots, was the totaling independently verified by a second official? So once again, you want to see that 2 people counted the ballots. Maybe there's 1 pile and 2 people, 1 person's putting them in and counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or maybe they make multiple piles and a different person counts them after someone's put them in a pile, say of 25, for example. And that's quite a question we're asking here. It's important if there's multiple teams counting, and if there's multiple districts being counted in the course of the day, if one team did not verify and have a second official verify the count on the piles of the ballots, then the answer here is no. Even if you have 10 teams in 3 districts and one team in one of those districts didn't do the job of double checking, then the answer is no. Page 2. Once again, answer the following questions on what could have been observed, and note there's 2 methods of counting votes: sorting and stacking by candidate, and then counting the stacks. And B, reading and making hash marks for each vote, then totaling the hash marks. And carefully note the following questions is about vote counting in races, not about counting ballots. Question CM2, please describe the room layout and counting team arrangements for counting the votes in races. You might say there were 2 teams of 4 people and they each sat around different tables, oblong tables for example, or there were 2 teams of 2 people and they all sat around a conference table. Counting methods for vote in races by 1 or more teams of counters. So all the teams use the hash mark methods for votes in races. All the teams use the sorting and stacking method for votes in races. So once again, hash marking, they typically have 1 or 2 people reading the votes in the races. One person reading a vote on a ballot and another person watching to make sure they read it correctly. And then 2 people or 1 person making hash marks on a sheet. You know, strokes, 1, 2, 3, 4, and across of 5, keeping track of the votes in the races. Sorting and stacking methods for votes in races, what they do is they will take the ballots and make 1 pile for candidate A, 1 pile for candidate B, maybe 1 pile for candidate C, and another pile for no votes in that race or an overvote. And then they will count the number of ballots in each of those stacks to determine the counts. You'll see the sorting and stacking method quite often in a primary when only 1 race is being counted. Hash marking, you'll see a little bit more often when more than 1 race is being counted, like a November election. So answer C, methods vary by race, but for each race the teams use the same method. D, methods vary between teams even for the same race. And if applicable, how did the methods vary between the teams and races? So CM4, double checking by officials. So if only hash marking was used for counting races, you would answer yes or no for the hash marking method and not applicable for sorting and stacking methods. If they use both methods for different races or for different districts or different teams used different methods, one team used hash marking and another team used sorting and stacking, then you answer all the questions for those teams that did hash marking and the other questions for all the teams that did sorting and stacking. So did a second official observe that each vote was read accurately? Did a second official make duplicate hash marks or observe that each hash mark was recorded accurately? Was the vote counting such that a second official verified that each vote was stacked as marked? Were the stacks of ballots counted such that a second official verified that each stack was counted accurately? If you answered yes for teams of 2, please explain how the second official checked the first official. So a team of 4, it's obvious how that would happen. If it's a team of 2, we just like to know how they did the double checking, if double checking was done. And here's a little note, and basically it says many of these questions can be answered along the way, but many of them you need to answer at the end of the day, or you can tentatively answer, but then they audit another district, they use different methods, they suddenly start not checking when they checked earlier. So you can answer these questions whenever you want, but you should probably check at the end of the day to make sure that you've answered all the questions, and number 2, that things like double checking actually occurred as the day went on. Question CM5, transparency and observability when counting votes in races. Once again, were you permitted to observe that each vote was read accurately? Were you permitted to observe that each hash mark was recorded accurately? Were you permitted to observe that each vote was placed in the correct stack? Were you permitted to see that the count of ballots and piles for each race was accurate? Please explain any no answers. Once again, you don't have to look into everything. This is what you were able to observe in the time you had and when you were observing particular teams. Blind counting. Blind counting occurs when counting teams are unaware of the total and discrepancies while they are counting and recounting. So we want to know if someone leading the audit came in, for instance, and said, oh, there is 185 ballots, so that's our goal. Or let's say they count the ballots and they say, oh, you know, the number was 168, but we're 3 ballots short. You need to go through and find those 3 ballots. No, we don't want that. What we want is for the counters to be kept unaware of the tabulator totals for the ballots or races they were counting until counting and recounting each race was complete. So it looks a little suspicious when a leader says, oh, you counted 95 votes for Smith, but you made a mistake because there's really 94 votes for Smith. So you've got to go through the ballots again and come up with the right count. So that comes into question B. If the initial counts were off, were counters kept unaware of the exact and approximate level of difference? So it's okay for a leader to say something like, oh, you know, our totals don't match the numbers on the tape from election night. Why don't we count again and see if our numbers are correct? Sort of a neutral statement between that the machine, not indicating that the machine is always right. It could be that our counters are right and that the machine is off by a bit. CM7, ballots with questionable markings. Now, ballots with questionable markings is ballots that have votes that have bubbles that were partially filled in. And the idea is the accounting for the audit is such that the machine might have counted those and it might not have counted those. And when that's the case, we don't want to say the machine was wrong when it didn't count something. And we don't want it to say the machine was wrong when it did count something if a bubble is partially filled in. This is not voter's intent. If the voter circled the bubble but didn't put any mark in the bubble, the machine should not have counted it. It's not questionable. Questionable votes on ballots ruled upon separately, vote by vote, rather than all votes on such ballots, all classified as questionable when some were not questionable. So they should be putting ballots with questionable votes aside to count separately and carefully. But some of those ballots might have perfectly good votes on them, and some have votes that are questionable. They should be counting the questionable votes in a particular race as questionable, but other votes that are okay in other races, count those as just regular, what they call undisputed votes. Question B, were questionable votes ruled on prior to tallying of votes for each race and counts not adjusted based on knowledge of the results of the differences in counts for the race. So sometimes they will count all the ballots and not classify any or very few as questionable, and they get down to the end and the machine did not count as many votes as the people did, and then they'll say, well, we've got to go through these ballots and find 3 more votes that are questionable. So if that happens, then you would say no to question B. And once again, you're observing all this. You're not telling anybody they're doing something wrong. You're just observing and recording what they did. CM8, officials and observers and others present. So we have the number of supervising officials. That's not every election official. That's the people in charge, like the registrars, or maybe a head moderator. It's sort of a judgment call if someone is a supervisor or just a counter. And question D is the number of counting team personnel. So all the officials there supervising and counting, A plus D should add up to the number of officials doing work or supervising. Number of the public, including observers. That includes yourself. Number of media. Not very often, but once in a while some member of the media is there. We want to keep track of that. They're not included as part of the public. D, as we said, the number of counting team personnel. E, the number of counting teams. And F, the number of individuals on the smallest counting team. So maybe they have 3 teams of 4, and then maybe somebody doesn't show up. So the 4th team only has 3 people, or it has 2 people on it. Then the answer would be that smallest team, 2 or 3 people. If one of the supervisors actually joins one of the counting teams, then they're really a member of that counting team as well. Number of others present, for instance, candidates, or maybe the town clerk or something like that. They're not quite really a member of the public. They're not a member of the media. And Question H, if you know, what was the media? Was it a particular television station, a local newspaper? If there were candidates what candidates were they, etc. They're not necessarily required to answer that, but usually if you talk to them, you'll know who it is. Discovering and resolving mismatches, question CM9. And once again, this is based on what could have been observed. And the thrust of these questions is not checking everything. Check some hash mark sheets. Can you see or hear the numbers reported by each team or for each batch? Could you have checked them all given enough time? Could you have verified the addition of the counts were transcribed and added correctly? Were they entered accurately on the official report form? Could you have checked all the numbers on the scanner tape against the numbers on the official report form? A, did officials find a match between machine counts and manual counts at the end of the initial count of each race? B, did officials try to resolve mismatched counts by counting again? C, did officials try to resolve mismatched counts by changing counting teams? That is, counting different ballots by different teams. Did officials resolve mismatched counts by the end of the audit? Please explain any no answers. Tallying procedures and tallying transparency. Were you able to observe that hash marks and totals of batches for each team were tallied accurately? Were you able to observe that the number of ballots from multiple teams and batches were totaled accurately? Were you able to observe that the number of votes from multiple teams and batches were totaled accurately? Once again, this is observe what you can observe in the time that you have. This doesn't say that you have to check every hash mark and every batch from every team, etc. This concludes our discussion of most of the questions that vary between the manual audits and the electronic audits. The rest of the questions that vary between them will be covered as part of the next video, which, like the first video, covers questions that apply both to the manual audit and to the electronic audit. Thank you.